Okay, you guys, so this is your lecture for History 1302, and it's on World War II. So what you need to do is go to End Grade and pull up the PowerPoint for World War II that you're going to find on End Grade on the week that we're covering this. Okay, so that week of February 22nd. So when we talked about World War I, as you remember, we were talking about the consequences of it in the Treaty of Versailles and how the Germans were left with all these reparations that they had to pay and the war guilt and all of that. So we talked about how that left the Germans psychologically very, very upset, and also the German economy was left in a mess. And so after that war in you have the 1920s and into the 1930s, in Germany you have a rise of what's called fascism. Okay, we're going to talk about what that is. But Hitler is able to become popular because the Germans were so crushed economically, psychologically after the First World War. And Hitler comes along and says, I'll make you guys proud of Germany again. And that's very appealing, okay? Okay, so the rise of fascism. Okay, so what's fascism? Okay, it's a governmental system that promotes aggressive nationalism, often racism as well, and it often is going to suppress any opposition. Okay, so like in a democracy, you can be opposed to the government, you can protest it, like we talked about with the women's suffrage movement. It's a democratic right of those women to be protesting things. Okay, in a fascist country, you can't do that. Okay, you're going to be crushed if you are opposing. So Hitler develops this fascist regime in Germany, and the racism, okay, is against the Jewish people in Germany and everywhere else. And the aggressive nationalism is where, remember we talked about nationalism, okay, it's like patriotism. The aggressive nationalism of Hitler is where he's saying Germany's pride is going to be restored, and Germany's going to be the greatest country, and Germany's going to be a militarily aggressive country. Okay, next slide, please. So you have to remember, Europe, including Germany, has suffered a lot from World War I. So there's unemployment, there's food shortages, democratic systems are weak, and the fascist systems that are in Germany and in Italy become strong at this time. So in Germany, the fascists are called Nazis, okay? And the Nazi message to the German people is popular at this time because it's a time of crisis, it's a time of anxiety, and people are depressed, okay? They're not happy with the outcome of the war. They're not happy with Germany having all of that guilt about World War I. And so when Hitler comes along and says, I'll restore your pride, then... So, Hitler is being very aggressive. He's trying to not just get Germany's pride back, but he wants to get more land for Germany. Okay, so he's got a very aggressive approach of invading other countries to get more land for Germany. So on this slide, you're going to see the orange arrow is showing German aggression. So you're going to see Germany in purple in the middle on this slide, and the orange arrow is going out showing all of the countries and all of these directions that Hitler is sending his armies into. So the war is partly in Europe with Hitler invading these other countries in Europe, and it's partly in the Pacific Ocean because Japan has allied with Hitler, and Japan has attacked the United States, and that brings the United States into the war, and it really becomes a global war. Okay, so it starts when Germany invades Poland in September of 1939. Very quickly and very shockingly, this is very shocking to France and England and the United States, that after Germany takes Poland, the German troops quickly march into other countries, and those countries fall to Germany really quickly, okay? Germany smashes through Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland, and France. France falls. France is an important power in Europe, and it falls pretty quickly to Germany, and this is shocking. And in the Pacific, like I said, Japan attacks the United States by attacking the Navy of the United States, which is based in Pearl Harbor, on the Hawaiian island, off the Hawaiian island of Oahu, out there in the Pacific, okay? So at first, President Roosevelt, okay, he's the President of the United States when this is happening. He understands that the Americans want to stay out of this war. They're thinking, oh my God, we had just gone over to Europe to help the Europeans with their conflict in World War I. Now the Europeans are going at it again. We want to stay out of it. So the Americans are feeling isolationist, okay? To be isolationist means they want to stay isolated, they want to stay at home, they don't want to go get involved. And so isolationism in the U.S. and the hesitation on the part of France and England to really do anything about Hitler, that causes both Germany and Japan to think that the United States and England and France lack the will to oppose them. So Japan thinks it can get away with bombing the U.S. like that, knocking out the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor, and that the U.S. isn't going to respond. Well, they're wrong, okay? It has the opposite effect. It makes the U.S. jump into the war on the side of Britain and France, and this ultimately causes Germany to lose the war. If the Americans hadn't gotten involved, France has already fallen, England was going to fall to Germany, and if the US hadn't got involved, Europe could look very different today, or at least for a long time, it could have been very, very different. Okay, next slide. So, President Roosevelt in the US is worried about fascism and this kind of aggression, but he's also understanding that the Americans want to stay out of it, okay, before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And Churchill, who's the British Prime Minister at the time, is begging Roosevelt for help, okay, because Churchill sees that Britain is going to really need help to defeat Germany. The Germans are starting to bomb London, and people in London are starting to have to sleep in. You guys have probably, most of you, been to London, and I don't know if you've ridden on the tube, you know, the underground metro system. Down there in those kind of tunnels, a lot of people in London had to sleep, okay, because the Germans were bombing the city. So let's go to the next slide. So Churchill is sort of secretly helping Britain, knowing that the Americans don't really want to support getting involved, but then everything changes when Japan attacks the Americans at Pearl Harbor. Okay, that turns the American feelings away from saying we want to remain isolated. Okay, turns that isolationist feeling into let's go get them. Okay, they've just done this shocking attack on us. Now, when President Roosevelt declares war on Germany and Japan, now the country is behind him. Okay, so on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and the next day, Roosevelt goes ahead and declares war, and then Hitler returns back with his own declaration of war on the US. Okay, so now it's really a global war. Okay. So you've got the war in the Pacific. Okay, you're going to see this slide. It's talking about these battles in the Pacific where the US has to be on two fronts. It has to be over in Europe helping the British and the French against Germany, and it's got to be over in the Pacific fighting Japan. Okay, go ahead and change the slide. So this is what Europe looks like during the war. Now, to mention the names of the alliances again, the alliances are really similar to what we had in World War I. Okay, the Axis powers are Germany and Italy, and they're just, in this war, they're called the Axis. And the other side, which is Russia and England and France and the US, just like in World War I, they're simply called the Allies. Okay, next slide. Just to mention a couple things that happened domestically in the United States as a cause of the US being involved in World War II. There's some shifts that happen at home in the US. One thing is that everyone becomes freaked out, of course, about Germans and Japanese. Okay, these are the enemy at this point. Now, in places like California, where there's tons of Japanese people, there is a very unfortunate situation that happens where there's this fear of Japanese people. Could they be spies? You know, there are enemies right now. Could they be spies for the Japanese government? So those Japanese are rounded up by the US government and put in what's called internment camps. So they have to leave their homes and they have to go stay in these camps where they are not allowed to leave for the duration of the war. This is a little different from the concentration camps where the Germans put the Jews, which are really, really brutal, and most people don't survive it. The Japanese internment camps, you know, they're not doing this extreme hard labor, they're not being starved, they are being fed, but still it's considered later by historians and politicians and everything, it's considered to be not such a good thing that the US government did that. So you can read more about that on this slide. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. By the way, the wife of President Roosevelt, her name was Eleanor Roosevelt, she was opposed to rounding up the Japanese and putting them in these camps. This is one time when she went against her husband and she said, you know, we shouldn't be doing this. This was an unprecedented action in U.S. history. Almost 50 years later, Congress passed this act saying that this was not a just thing, that it was an injustice on the Japanese people, and Congress said, we're going to pay the victims of this for their suffering. Okay, next slide. Now, the other thing happening at home, domestically in the U.S. during this war, is that suddenly women go into the workforce by the thousands. This is because the men are, think about, you know, how many men you need to send abroad if you're fighting Japan in the Pacific and Germany over in Europe, which is, Germany's been a very difficult enemy, very, very aggressive. Like I said, you know, it was shocking that France fell so quickly to Germany. The United States has its hands full trying to help France and England defeat the Germans. Both France and England, just like I said, without the U.S. help, they never would have made it. And then the U.S. is over in the Pacific as well. So this causes a lot of women to go into the workforce in an unprecedented way in the U.S. Okay, so at the height of the war, about 20 million women go to work in these factories that are making weapons and making airplanes, okay, for this war. So let's look at the next slide. Now, male workers, it's a few who are still around and not fighting abroad,